name is George Galloway, presenter of كلمة on الميادين television. Mind you, I don't mince my words. I speak كلمة and my audience does too. كلمة free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on الميادين television, coming from London, but talking about Afghanistan, in particular, seeking to learn some lessons from the long nightmare of 20 years of NATO occupation of that country, which ended so ignominiously with the American armed forces stealing in the middle of the night out of the country like a thief in the night. Redolent of the collapse of American power in Southeast Asia, in Saigon, in 1975, at least for people of my age. The story of Afghanistan, of course, is longer than 20 years. I myself warned Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister of Britain in the 1980s, that her actions had, and I quote myself, opened the gates for the barbarians, and a long dark night will now descend upon the people of Afghanistan. I never said a truer word, actually. A long nightmare led to the catastrophe that we have all witnessed, a humanitarian catastrophe, a civil rights catastrophe, a disaster for women catastrophe, and of course the total degradation of the standard of life of a people who were already amongst the very poorest in the world, with virtually no public services, virtually no infrastructure of any kind. So the long occupation came to an ignominious end, but the implications of it, even for the occupiers, have not gone away. If you speak to a homeless person on the streets of Britain, for example, there's a very high chance that the person now living rough on the streets will once upon a time have been a part of Britain's occupation army in Afghanistan. If you speak to people who are in the mental health system, people who are living in real poverty in Britain, that shows that it's not just the thousands of NATO service personnel who gave their lives, but also those who gave their health, including their mental health, in the NATO occupation. A disaster all round, but of course far, far bigger a disaster for the poor Afghans who endured effectively 40 years of unbroken war, a kind of medieval length of war, rather than a part of what you might have imagined in the modern era. Not that it taught the Americans a lesson. They were no sooner out of Afghanistan, but they were into Ukraine and threatening to go into China also. So it seems defeat doesn't always chasten empires. Perhaps it will have to be a final defeat that brings the long period of Western empire to a close. As always, I'm just the enthusiastic amateur here. I'm joined by a group of distinguished experts, and let me introduce them to you now. Dr. Imran Ali Panjwani is the head of diverse legal consulting in the UK and a senior lecturer in law at Anglia Ruskin University. Dr. Panjwani, let's start with the humanitarian cost of all this. What was the net effect of 20 years of NATO expenditure of $1 trillion and more on the people of Afghanistan? One imagines with that level of spend, they must have been rather prosperous by the end, were they?
Not at all. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. The net effect is that about 70,000 Afghan civilians have died. That's one. Two is that 92% of the population is suffering from food deprivation. And according to the Watson Institute of Boston University, they said that people are living on $1.90 a day. So that's the net effect on the Afghan civilians, not to mention the degradation of their mental health and mental well-being. And that's apart from the troops that have died and have been injured. So about 2,500 US troops and about 20,000 US troops being injured. So the net effect isn't anything positive. In fact, it's a destructive effect.
Some people gained, though. The military-industrial complex in the West gained a lot, although they left most of the weapons behind them because they were in such a hurry to run away. And now the Russians are using some of that weaponry against other American weaponry in the hands of Ukrainians. But not only Western arms companies, some of the political class in Afghanistan made off with quite a bundle.
Yes, I mean, that's natural. In war, people can exploit, whether it is oil, whether it's position, whether it's having private contracts and private relationships with the government, or the government that has come into the country. And I think that's a natural effect. But in terms of your question, the overall net effect is something positive on the country or something positive on the population. I think that would be in the negative. But yes, as you know that over centuries, there'll always be a few people that will benefit from war, yes.
What about the question of women? They undoubtedly made a return to the workplace. I mean, once upon a time before the late 1980s, women were everywhere. I've been there and talked to women professors and journalists and broadcasters and so on. I knew Afghanistan in former times. They made something of a return to public life before the return of the Taliban to power. Didn't they gain anything lasting?
They would gain the freedoms that the state or the way the state was run at that time afforded them. Has it lasted now? Currently, no, because the Taliban are back in the power. And I would say that women's rights is like a toy or a chess piece used to justify a greater action. So I think that looking at that, it's a kind of short-term gain, but what's the long-term policy and strategy? And are we saying that is a huge positive that perhaps outweighs other things? I'm not so sure. That's the way I would look at the way the policy operates.
Dr. Saida Ani Wakar is an academic and consultant, as well as being an artist, and she's from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster. Welcome back, Doctor. What would you say are the main lessons to be learned from the failed occupation of Afghanistan?
There's a very long history with regards to Afghanistan, and firstly, I believe that when NATO and US joined forces together, this was for counterinsurgency. So there you have always certain tenets when you go into a country which is failing. The three tenets are: you hold, you clear, you hold, and then you build. And unfortunately, the NATO forces as well as the US has failed in a lot of ways there. They're able to clear, but they haven't been able to hold. And in terms of building, unfortunately, there's always a relationship between military and civilian. And that relationship has been affected massively, especially with regards to the civilian, on the ground. Because once you have cleared an area, which is deemed to be quite insecure, or where you think that, insurgencies might take place again and again, you're there, but then you're not able to hold and not able to protect that area, not secure that area. And that was the biggest, I think, defeat that I say has been in terms of looking at how they have actually been trying to rebuild. So once you have left that place, just cleared it, and you are forcing, the contractors, the civilian contractors to build something, to bring schools, to have a sort of an infrastructure, they themselves are afraid because they're not very sure whether that place is secure or not. So I believe that that's where the tenets, the three main tenets, they have failed completely. And also, I was just reading the other day about how, I'm sure everybody has seen, on the television when the troops were leaving, how the locals were hanging on to the C-19 flights. I mean, those images were horrific. They were left with this idea that there's now nothing left. They were hopeless because they knew that these guys are now leaving and we have nothing left. And I think that is where they have massively failed, because they were not able to secure it, not able to rebuild. In fact, they just left it in the most horrendous state. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that, because from the very beginning, I think the plan had actually not been implemented properly.
Isn't it the case, Aqib Mahmood, a political activist, twice a candidate for the London Assembly, isn't it the case that no one, not even Alexander the Great, has managed to clear and hold Afghanistan? No one can successfully occupy Afghanistan, can they?
Absolutely, George. The thing that you have to remember is that the people of Afghanistan, they value their freedom above all else. Now, whether that takes shape in the form of Mujahideen in the 80s, or whether that was the Taliban, or whether if we go back into history when the British invaded in the 1800s, they fought fierce wars, down to the last man, down to the last bullet, just to maintain their freedom. And it's the oldest nation in Asia, nation state in Asia, and they have maintained their freedom to this day. And they've seen off, as you said, superpowers, whether it's from Alexander the Great all the way up to the United States and the Soviet Union in between that. So they do maintain their freedom at almost every cost. The other thing that we have to remember is, and following on from the doctor's point, that the plan, nobody actually knew what the plan was going in. They went in with a strategic plan that we will bomb these people out of existence and we will stay there for the next 100 years and we will control the region, because Afghanistan is the heart of Asia. If there is peace in Afghanistan, or if you control Afghanistan, you control Asia. If there is instability in Afghanistan, the whole of Asia is unstable. And that is what they wanted. They got the second best prize, which was to make it unstable, and left. And that's what they've left Afghanistan with.
They destabilized Pakistan apart from anywhere else, didn't they?
It's not just Pakistan, because, as I said, the entire region depends on a stable Afghanistan. If you look at China and its interests in Afghanistan, if you look at Russia and the route that it needs to get to the warm waters of the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, that all depends on a stable Afghanistan. And so the reason why the Americans left in such a hurry, and why they allowed the Taliban to take over in such a way in 2020, was that they wanted to get the second best prize, which was, if we can't have it, no one can. And so we'll just leave it as a no man's land, which is unstable. It's going to be, a place of intrigue, and it's full of spies, and, all of these different countries are using their own machinations to achieve their own ends, and it's a complete mess.
Let's hear from Professor Paul Moorcraft, nowadays in Wales, but when I first knew him, he was an official at the UK Ministry of Defence. Professor, welcome to the show.
Well, it's nice to talk to you, George.
Dr. Paul, with your extensive experience of war zones and conflict, what do you think are the main lessons we should draw from the failed 20-year NATO occupation of Afghanistan?
The simplest thing, which I know you'll agree with, George, is that the more the West intervenes, the more problems they cause. Ever since the end of the First Cold War, 1991, every single Western intervention, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, whatever, has caused lots of problems. So that is one of the obvious measures, because you could argue that the West intervened in Russia. It was all the young experts, American experts, going into Russia after 1991 and telling the Russians how to run their economy, which was very humbling for a proud nation. So all the Western interventions, nearly always, there's one or two examples in Sierra Leone, but mostly it's been disastrous. And in Afghanistan, it has been totally counterproductive. the state is much worse than it was before, despite 20 years of nation building. So it's counterproductive, and maybe it's arrogant to assume that the West can build nations.
Could the Americans and their allies have achieved anything in Afghanistan?
Well, initially, they did control al-Qaeda. Now, despite what's said in the bazaars, most of the bazaars in the Middle East, personally, I don't doubt that Osama bin Laden's organization had a great deal to do with 9/11. And they were driven out of Afghanistan. But was it necessary to control the whole country for so long? Well, no. No, because most of the fighters in Afghanistan were simple nationalists. They were the same people who had been fighting, inverted commas, on the American side against the Russians in the 80s, which I experienced. So, but there was some development. Of course there was. Women's education, which the Taliban has frankly reversed, education, schools, hospitals, there was some development despite the tremendous corruption. So the West did try to modernize the state, but it's pointless if the people within that state don't want to have that kind of modernization.
Well, it was evident from more or less the beginning that President Bush wasn't up to the successful occupation of Afghanistan, but several other presidents came and went and continued the same policy. Why did they all fail?
To understand Afghanistan, you have to understand the history, you have to understand the clans, the various groups, the various religions. It is a complicated country, and it is not a Western country. It's entirely different culturally. And that is one reason why you simply can't graft a modern economy onto a traditional one. And there was a lot of eagerness, I think, particularly in the cities, to develop and to adopt education and modern system. And the lots of newspapers, lots of television, lots of radio. In the countryside, very little had changed. And that's where the strength of the Taliban, the resistance to the Americans were. So it didn't work, but I think there were some genuine intentions. The idea of naked imperialism is just, it's just not right. People were trying to do some good, not just the soldiers, but civil societies, NGOs. They were trying. And now look at the country. People are starving.
If it's obvious that the occupiers did not really understand Afghanistan, it's obvious that this has been repeated over and over again since. Repeated in Iraq, repeated in Libya. They attempted to repeat it in Syria. Why don't these people learn the lessons of these societies that they invade, occupy, and then have to run away from?
Well, it's like saying imperialism. There was a religious element to reform in Africa, to help people, to educate and train. There's always been an idealistic element, I think. But mostly it's simple, straightforward exploitation. And in a sense, the Americans believe that they should expand their way of living, and people don't want that. It just doesn't work. And the more you try to enforce a foreign ideology onto a traditional society, particularly one which is very strongly Islamist, or Islamic, it is a waste of time. But there are an awful lot of urban people in Afghanistan who are sorry that the Americans have gone. You can't just say it was all bad. There were some attempts to improve society, but there was too much corruption. That was one of the big issues, a bit like Pakistan. There's so much corruption, it's difficult to reform.
So, shall I infer from your answer that these mistakes may well be made again elsewhere, despite the $1 trillion spend, if you include the American budget and the budgets of the other NATO countries, the thousands of NATO personnel that were either killed or maimed or had their minds gravely affected, that notwithstanding all of that, no real lesson will be learned. It will be repeated somewhere else.
Are you talking about Ukraine, do you think? Are you implying that there will be formal intervention? Because I believe that's already NATO is not just a proxy war. There's an actual war now between NATO and the Kremlin. Formally, there are no American or NATO troops inside Ukraine, but the amount of equipment that's being poured in, yes, we have another intervention. Although it is part of Europe, it is part of the NATO area, whereas NATO went so-called out of area to fight in Afghanistan. How often can you keep on making the same mistake? I don't know the answer to that. People should stop intervening. The West should stop intervening, particularly in Islamic countries, unless they're invited in because of a natural disaster, as in Turkey or in Syria now. So it was a mistake, and the result has been disaster. But whether the Americans and the West have learned, I don't know. Maybe Ukraine will change it all.
Very candid, wasn't he, for a former Ministry of Defence official? But there's an Orientalism which tinges these kind of perspectives. He's a very nice man, so I don't mean to insult him, but it's almost as if they're saying the Afghans don't want modern things. They don't want freedom as we know it. But that's actually not true. I myself have walked amongst them when they were practicing modernity. It's Western policy that has created the conditions that they now like to ascribe to the backwardness of the Afghans.
Very true, George. Rather conveniently, he failed to acknowledge the fact that the Mujahideen and the Taliban and the jihadist mentality was actually written up in the West. The entire curriculum was created in Germany and in NATO countries and passed over into the madrasas and seminaries of Pakistan, which were bordering the Afghan border in the 80s. And that's where these people were created. This mentality and this jihadist mindset that he's talking about, where the countryside is backward and underdeveloped, and they don't want to, there's some kind of Luddites who don't want to, have the modern conveniences or freedoms that you get.
Dr. Saida, isn't that correct, what Akib says, that the problem with talking about plans and so on, you see, I used to hear this about Iraq. It was Paul Bremer's fault. He didn't have a plan. These things are inherently flawed, aren't they? That for countries from thousands of miles away to invade and occupy someone is inherently doomed, isn't it?
I mean, he very rightly kind of said that Afghanistan is a very complicated country, but you've got to understand the history of Afghanistan. I mean, back in the days, in the 60s, 50s, Afghanistan was, like you said, it was the epitome of modernity. People all over from South Asia used to go watch films, theatres, go and listen to traditional music, dancing in Afghanistan, all the way from India and Pakistan. So, I mean, I do believe that there is always this inherent problem, with understanding, have this Orient, view. And as you rightly, suggested, one of the panelists, that when you have Mujahideen who have been backed by the US to fight against the Soviet Union invasion, now how do you go about that? I mean, history has been written. So who were those people who were backed up by these Mujahideens to actually, fight against the Soviets?
Well, I used to say in Parliament regularly, you've punished the Afghan people twice. You punished them first by bringing these people to power, and now you're punishing them because these people are in power. There's much more to say. We'll be right back after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, in London for الميادين television, talking about Afghanistan. Now, I first met my next guest more than 40 years ago when he was the chief foreign correspondent for the Guardian newspaper, when that was something to be. Nowadays, not quite so much. He's an author of tons of books, the latest of which is Ghosts of Afghanistan. He is Jonathan Steele. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure.
Jonathan, in your book, you make it clear that this was another of the Bush and Blair wars, but plenty of presidents and prime ministers continued the war and occupation afterwards. Who should share the blame for this disaster?
Well, I think the failure was at the very beginning when they decided to topple the Taliban, which was not necessary if they were going after Al-Qaeda, because Osama bin Laden, although he had been a guest of the Taliban, after the 9/11 atrocities in New York and Washington, he left Kandahar and went into the mountainous area where he was beyond the control of the Taliban. And the Taliban had no previous knowledge of the 9/11 planning. It was a surprise to them, just as it was to everybody else in the world. So the mistake was to go in and topple the Taliban. They should have just mounted some kind of police action to find Osama bin Laden and deal with Al-Qaeda without overthrowing the regime of the country of Afghanistan, which was at that time the Taliban.
You make the point, few could dispute it, that it was a fundamental mistake to attack the Taliban rather than hunt down Al-Qaeda. But what about the subsequent period of occupation? Who takes the blame for that?
Well, they were embarked on a plan which was to try and build up Afghan military forces and to develop the country economically. But there was massive corruption, and the economic programs that they put through didn't work very strongly outside the main cities of Mazar-e-Sharif and Kabul and Kandahar. So most Afghans got no benefit from it. And the tactics of the US forces particularly, which was the dominant group in the NATO contingent, were often quite brutal. They were using night raids where they would go into villages and surround compounds, storm in and embarrass the people who were often unrelated to the Taliban. So they created their own enemies by their bad tactics, military tactics. They were going into houses where there were ladies, and there was a violation, obviously, of people's private areas of their houses and land. And with foreign troops coming in, it was considered criminal by the Afghan people, and they didn't welcome the US and NATO forces.
It's pretty obvious that incoming administrations, whether in Washington or London, were aware that the policy wasn't working. Why didn't they change it? Why did no incoming administration, who must all have known that the policy was failing, why didn't they change it? Why did they keep on doubling down?
Well, they wanted to withdraw at various points, but they could never be clear that the Afghan military forces would be able to fill the vacuum when the foreign forces left. So every time they came up with a plan to leave by the end of a particular year or the year after that, they said, well, we're not really ready because the Afghan forces aren't in a position to take control. So that meant that there was never any kind of deadline. So ultimately, the Doha Agreement of 2020, which laid down the conditions for withdrawal, was just an open-ended commitment by the US to leave and NATO to leave without any real guarantees from the other side that the Taliban would cease fighting.
It's a hypothetical question, of course, but wouldn't it have been better to deal with the Al-Qaeda issue, leave the Taliban in power, than to effectively hand them back the keys to Afghanistan 20 years later with all the damage that had been done in between?
Well, it's hard to make a comparison because it's hypothetical, but I think that was the basic equation, that at least when the Americans left, there would be peace at last, instead of 35, 40 years of civil war. So that would be a great benefit. The foreign troops would leave, there would be no more fighting, and that has pretty much happened. The Taliban are in almost 98% control of the country. There are one or two pockets where they don't control it, but basically they control the whole country. And but the civil society has been squashed, and human rights for women particularly have been squashed.
President Bush said he wanted to introduce a modern democracy in in Afghanistan. Of course, he failed. He didn't know how to do that. How could he? There's not really a modern democracy in his own country. But that seems to imply that this kind of nation building, exporting Western ideas of democracy will be repeated, will be carried out again and again in one place or another.
Well, you cannot bring democracy through the barrel of a gun. That is the main lesson. You can't just fight your way to bringing democratic society if there has not been one before. But if it's a country like Afghanistan that's never had democracy, you can't rebuild it when there's peace, because there's no tradition of democracy, there's no understanding of what it means, there's no acceptance of compromise and give and take in a political arena. So that is the problem. You can't bring democracy at the barrel of a gun.
Dr. Imran Ali, let me put another lesson that should be learned to you. I know that in your legal field you've come across this. A whole section, we could call them a comprador, of Afghan society attached themselves to the occupation as interpreters, as soldiers, police officers, and so on. And some of them were left hanging on to the wheels of the American aircraft as they left. Many, many thousands of them are not welcome in the countries that they served, and are regarded as collaborators by the people in their own society. Isn't one of the lessons, don't trust the empire to look after you when things go upside down?
Yes, exactly. And in fact, in 2021, along with some other community centres, we were dealing with the Afghanistan evacuation crisis. And exactly this problem reared its ugly head. And interpreters, contractors, they were trying to escape Afghanistan. We were writing to MPs, members of parliament, saying, look, can you please give them safe passage? And just to give you this sort of real life experience, I was writing letters on behalf of my consultancy, and they would show the letters to the military guards in the airport. They were allowed to come in the airport and enter the airport, but they were stopped at the last gate to enter the airplane. Why? Because there was a military database. I'm just giving the example of the United Kingdom. There was a military database of who could board the plane and who couldn't. So first of all, that's primary evidence for you that there was already people selected based on a particular criteria, which we can go in later, of who would board the plane and not. And as a second piece of evidence, and I'll end because other people want to speak, is that we do have data whereby there was meant to be insurance money exactly to help the contractors and interpreters and such people, but that insurance money that was actually promised by the Americans to give to those people who were suffering or needed to get out of the country was actually pocketed. And I think the figure is almost £60 million. Yes.
Well, blow me down. How surprised am I? Dr. Annie, again, we hear from Jonathan Steele about the situation of women. But isn't it the case that, first of all, women are part of the society? If the society is being crushed, then the fact that they can go out and work is only of marginal benefit. If their sons are being killed, if their houses are being stormed by the occupation forces, it's not going to be heaven on earth for women. But secondly, wasn't this just an urban phenomenon? The congestion zone of downtown Kabul was a woman-friendly zone, but the rest of the country was not.
That's absolutely correct. I think this is where the rebuilding of the state just went completely wrong, because they were only focused on the major cities. And outside, there was hardly any awareness, any school. Even if there were in certain villages, because there was a vacuum always left, you would always have some sort of insurgencies in those little villages somewhere. And the only thing that these coalition forces could do at that point, or the military could do, was just go in, try to clear the place, and then force the USAID and every other organization to sort of build as quickly as possible. Now, how is that possible? If you just leave a place, you think that it's clear, and then you leave, you actually, again, bringing in this massive gap. And hence, unfortunately, I think the further you go out from these congested zones, as you say, you will find that there's no awareness, no education, nothing, especially for women. And that has been the basic major issue. Even the civilian contractors who'd been contracted to help in interpretation, the women. In fact, I was in contact with this one particular woman who was an interpreter, and she could speak about 5-6 European languages. And she told me herself that how horrendous the situation was when they left. And she was told that, she'll be able to get some access somewhere in one of the European countries. And she wasn't. And she said that as soon as she moved out to her village outside, they had nothing, no schools, nothing. There was no infrastructure whatsoever. So she had been living, and they had been
in
telling
a fool's paradise,
in a fool's paradise completely. And as you must be aware of how, there has been a bombing, suicide bombing in a school in Afghanistan, where 85 young women, girls have been, killed. So it's an appalling state where you actually have just created certain congested zones. You have not gone beyond and rebuilt and reconstructed and helped the population that actually need that sort of awareness, unfortunately.
Akib, what's wrong with these people? In Saudi Arabia, more than half of the students in Saudi Arabia are girls. In Iran, girls and women are everywhere in the public sphere, particularly in education. What is it about the Taliban take on Islam that makes them so poisonously reactionary on these subjects?
There's a tendency to think of the Taliban as a monolith, which they're not. The Taliban is actually a mixture of disparate groups of, gangsters and criminals and, militant scholars and, not peaceful, but dialogue-orientated politicians as well are included in there. And so, the whole peace process to get to Doha and have that agreement for the US withdrawal, that was led by what you would describe as, for want of a better word, the moderates.
Moderate Taliban.
The moderate Taliban. And they were the people who were in Doha and who were willing to talk to the Americans and get things done. And so for a while, they had the upper hand. But when the Americans left, and the way that they left, and then they stopped all of the funding for all of these projects. So it's not just a case of the Taliban don't want these women or these girls or these people to be educated. The fact is that the Americans have stopped all the funding as well, because all of these projects were funded by the West. So all of the dollars that were flowing in for all of this, all of their foreign exchange reserves were frozen as soon as the Taliban came into power. And that was also down to the fact that the Afghan government that was installed, of the Ashraf Ghani government and the Afghan National Army that was built up by the Americans and the West over those 20 years, they didn't have the staying power, they did not have the capacity to hold off the Taliban. They assured the West that we will fight them. Time and again, the West and neighboring countries, Pakistan, Russia, China, all of them told them, look, you need to sit down with the Taliban and you need to come to an agreement. You need to come to a political agreement, a power sharing agreement, a national unity government of some kind where all of these rights and this constitution that you talk about can be protected. Bring them into the fold. And they were adamant that no, we will crush them. We have 300,000 troops. We have the latest weaponry from America. We have the best training. We've been trained for 20 years, etc., etc., etc. And what happened? They collapsed like a house of cards. Now the Americans saw this and decided to, throw more fuel on the fire and froze their assets, which allowed the hardliners to come back and say, well, we're going to do this, 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 and this, more and more extremist measures until to punish the Americans by punishing themselves. I know it sounds rather retrograde, but that's exactly what's happening there. So they are trying to get the moderates are trying to get international acknowledgement, trying to get some kind of aid, trying to get some kind of money into the country to fund these programs. The hardliners are saying, no, the international community has abandoned us, Pakistan has abandoned us, all of these neighboring countries have abandoned us, and we're going to do it our way, and we're going to, ban these girls, and we're going to ban education, and we're going to, get rid of every sign that the occupation was here. And these are signs that the occupation was there, because as everyone has acknowledged, that these were things that were built under the American occupation. And so that's the reaction that's coming from there. And the more America punishes them, the more the hardliners gain in strength, and the more the moderates in the Taliban that exist, they're finding harder to have a voice.
Doctor, what's the future for Afghanistan? It hasn't, the people are hungry. They've had a bitterly cold winter. As Aqib says, their own sovereign wealth, such as it was, has been stolen and frozen and will likely never be returned. But at the same time, the instability that Aqib thought the US might have settled for, that second prize, that hasn't really happened either, because the Afghans have been surprisingly adept at making quite decent relations with their old Russian foe, for example, with China, and even with Iran, religiously speaking, the very antithesis of their mindset. Which way is it going to break, do you think?
Well, I think that you have to allow a state to go through its complexities and emerge better. I mean, only in the 19th century here, Oxford and Cambridge refused to give degrees to women and Unitarians. So in both of the scholars' comments, said the two professors, as I said, there's that tinge of, as you said, Orientalism, this way of looking at the world, that Afghanistan is so complex and United Kingdom, for example, is not complex. I mean, you only have to see what we're suffering here with the protests. So I think, sadly, now we're in this state. As Jonathan Steele said, it would have been better had US and UK not gone in to such a degree in 2001, for example. But now we're in this state. You have to allow the complexities to play out. And the only thing I feel we can pray for is we don't want further loss of life. I think that this idea of women's rights is an important thing. Of course, it's an important thing, but it's not as important as somebody not being able to feed themselves or somebody losing their life. So as long as there is safety and this lack of conflict, at least that brings about some stability in which, as Aqib said, these kind of different elements can come into play.
Dr. Rani, that point about stability is a good one, isn't it? Because after the fall of Dr. Najibullah, a period of utter anarchy and chaos took place, and ironically, the Taliban were supported by the people to establish their rule in the first place because they brought order. They ended the period of savage anarchy. Are they capable of keeping that kind of order and stability now? Is the new Taliban going to be adept at that?
I think what analysis suggests is the Talibans are really very much, heavily relying on their raw natural resources as such. And at the same time, they are bringing out this modern, outlook, going to Doha, and telling, well, actually, we're not very much against women's education. In fact, we're, pretty much open with that. We're not the hardliners we were. But at the same time, when, Afghanistan was at that point occupied by these coalition forces, even the civilians were quite wary of the fact that now that, the Taliban voice has quite died down, they're not very annoying anymore. But in fact, these foreigners who are coming in and actually sort of like bringing in more chaos and corruption are pretty much annoying. And hence, it left quite a lot of vacuum, outside, these cities where Taliban obviously started to grow back in being popular. But I do believe that we can't go back to the future, but we can only, see that whether, these Western forces are willing to actually sit down and have a proper bilateral or, multilateral talks with Taliban and get to a certain point where, ideas or rebuilding state or how they are going to go about rebuilding that state.
Aqib, last word to you. Are they going to achieve the kind of stability that certainly their neighbours want to see? Or will this kind of no war, no peace situation that exists now between the West and Afghanistan lead to not just the growth or the strengthening of the hardliners in the Taliban, but even worse than the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS mentality? Might they begin to grow and then become a security threat, not just to the people around Afghanistan, but as we found out in New York and elsewhere, a security threat to everyone?
Absolutely, that's the greatest fear at the moment, because ultimately it's the West's responsibility. We went in there, we destroyed that country, we gave them the the idea that we're going to rebuild their nation and we're going to give them a constitutional democracy, and then we abandoned them to the Taliban. We took away all of their financial resources as well at the same time. So it's quite rich for us to sit here and point fingers at the Taliban, in the West, especially Western politicians, to say, oh, they're against women's education and they're against this and they're against that. But the reality is, we gave seats on planes to dogs, but we didn't give seats on planes to Afghans who helped, collaborated with our occupation. The reality is that we took away their money, and we're refusing to talk to them now and engage with them in any meaningful way. That's the reality, and that's what all of the region has to come together and explain to the West that this is not okay, and they need to come to the table with other countries in the region and help not the Taliban, but the people of Afghanistan. They need to offer them a solution to the problem that we have created.
Powerful final words from political activist Aqib Mahmood. There's lots of lessons, and we've only had time to perhaps skate over many of them. For me, the number one lesson is this. The NATO countries don't even look after their own soldiers after the war, so they're not going to look after yours. They don't even care about the suffering millions of cold, hungry, and increasingly unemployed people in their own countries, so how are they going to care about yours? The biggest lesson is that America is not to be trusted, that they are there not because they love you, not because they're your friends, but because of what you can do for them. And so I caution everyone who regards themselves as being in the American camp, in America's corner, don't imagine that because you're in America's corner that America is necessarily going to remain in yours. When the going gets tough, the tough get going, but the Americans get off on their marks, on the plane, out, never to be seen again. Perhaps a lesson for some elements in some other countries, particularly in Ukraine. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة حرة, and you have been a marvellous audience. Thanks for watching.